Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to my latest installment of Reads and Rambles, videos in a very irregular series that tell you about what I've been reading, watching, and doing over the last little while. Frequently, I mention family adventures, knitting, cooking, baking, etc., in addition to reading, but today I just have words on the brain. First, as I often do, I want to mention some ideas that sparked my interest in this week's New York Times book review. This time I want to mention two reviews. The first is John Adams' review of the new nonfiction book by Jed Pearl, a book called Authority and Freedom, A Defense of the Arts. I haven't read this short book yet, but I would love to take a look at it. According to the reviewer, Pearl's book explores the curious connection between authority and freedom, a connection between two ideas that at first might seem to be a joining of opposites. But at least in creative fields, authority and freedom don't make up a dichotomy. Authority refers here to the rule-based or conventional, but not something overpowering as it might mean if we're talking about authoritarian politics or something. Here it means something much more akin to canonical. As Pearl explains, it's when an artist understands the patterns, purposes, and skills of the history of the field or the genre. Those stories we always heard about artists copying the old masters in order to learn techniques is more or less what I think Pearl is referring to. And it is after artists learn that structure and meaning from the canon that Pearl suggests true creators turn to freedom. That is, after the already known becomes second nature, the artist can turn to breaking the rules, to challenging convention, to, as the saying goes, make it new. Pearl's argument is, at least as it appears in this review, that becoming a radical requires a creator to have learned the conventional. In other words, you need to know the rules in order to break them. Artistic freedom, as Pearl says, always involves engaging with some idea of order, which becomes an authority that the artist understands and acknowledges, but to which the artist doesn't necessarily entirely submit. What I think he's saying is that when freedom emerges after serious engagement with authority, perhaps tradition is a better word than authority here, that an artist can produce something timeless and lasting. The knowledge of precedent merges with a determination to break the precedent. This is not, of course, a new idea. But what I think separates what Pearl is saying from the hackneyed understanding of how creative work progresses is that Pearl expresses great concern that in today's world there is a push for work not to be timeless, but to respond to the moment in which we live, to be relevant. Here's a quote from the author. I want us to release art from the insistence that works of art, whether classic or contemporary, are validated by the extent to which they line up with or fail to line up with our current social and political concerns. According to the review, Pearl gives no examples of what he means about the pressure to be relevant. But I assume, and the reviewer assumes, he's talking about how both art itself and artistic venues, such as museums and theaters, are trying to address equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as other social justice issues. John Adams, the reviewer and the person who put together the opera Nixon in China, among other things, suggests that this whole take is a bit crazy. First, he points out that Pearl's argument is lame because he gives almost no examples. He fairly snarkily suggests that Pearl shies away from naming names and even naming issues because he's afraid he might be canceled on social media. And then he points out that many creatives these days are, as the reviewer says, ablaze with an intensity not seen since the 1930s to make their art speak truth to power, to heal what they deem the rent in our social fabric. What his New York Times review doesn't say is that the real dichotomy of the book is not authority versus freedom, but timelessness versus relevancy. Adams is much more interested in that sense of urgency than a sense of timelessness, as Pearl is. Clearly, this is a highly charged political disagreement as much as it is an artistic one. As I read this discussion, I started thinking about my own perspective here. As an historian, I have no interest in true timelessness, except in the way that that idea gets used in very time-specific ways across the years. You know what I mean there? That the desire to produce timeless work is, in fact, the product of a specific context itself, and that at various times over the years we do or do not care about it. As an historian, I'm especially interested in how art is responding to social change and cultural conflicts of a particular era, and not nearly as much interested in timeless beauty or power, although I know that's what many people want when they're looking at art. I know that mine is a fairly atypical way to view art and other creative works, and I certainly don't mean any of you should think about art that way. I guess I would really like to hear from all of you about how you feel about this issue. I suspect we are all moved when we look at so-called timeless works, and that we're all moved when we see specifically timely work produced in response to social injustice, too. I suspect many of us are extremely moved when we see that timely work even out of its time. I love the art and fiction of the 1930s, for example. But, like I said, I know I'm more interested in social and cultural context than I am in technique and timeless form. To use the words from Pearl's title, I'm more interested in freedom than I am in authority, even when those words are being used in the very specific artistic meaning that the author is employing. The other essay in the New York Times Book Review, which I want to mention, perhaps more briefly, is Claire Derriner's review of Jamie Attenborough's new book, I Came All This Way to Meet You, Writing My Way Home. The reviewer starts out by saying, there's a comfort in reading memoir. Whatever outlandish or terrible events befall the main character, we know that in the end, he or she is going to be essentially okay. Let me make one aside. I've recently read 2 memoirs about people dying of cancer, each written by the ill person with an epilogue by their widowed spouse, and both books were very successful, both in sales as well as in my personal opinion. So I'm not sure I agree with the reviewer about this particular assumption, though I totally get that most of the time she's right. Anyway, Detterer goes on to point out that when we read memoirs about writing, we sort of know twice that things turn out okay. The writer did, in fact, not only finish writing, but actually got a book published as well. This observation totally made me laugh. I'm not sure how many people really want to read memoirs about what writing means for individual authors, but clearly books about books are, in general, quite popular. On the other hand, that isn't necessarily true about all careers or jobs or types of work. Last week, when I mentioned the postscript tag, I mentioned that I had read 3 books at the beginning of January that I thought I would never be able to recommend to general readers, but that, it turns out, are really quite approachable and interesting. And all 3 are about work I didn't really think many people would want to read about. The books are all about human anatomy, and 2 of them are about first-year medical students dissecting a cadaver for the first time, as most medical students have been required to do, at least in the U.S., for a very long time. The first one I read, and which I just made my spouse David read, was Body of Work, Meditations on Mortality from the Human Anatomy Lab by the author Christine Montrose. Montrose entered medical school kind of late, after she had a life partner and a burgeoning career as a poet. The book is her account of dissecting Eve, the name she and her team used to refer to their cadaver, chosen because she did not have a belly button, an oddity that's probably explained by abdominal surgery or something early in her life. But Eve is, of course, also a perfect name for the one who will be the source of all that Montrose and her peers learn in their medical training. Although the book is centered around Montrose's own experiences in the anatomy lab during her first semester of medical school, it also spins off to talk about not only the global history of the use of human cadavers, but the much larger story of learning how to be a doctor. The writing is beautiful, and she grapples with her own quotidian emotional growth in ways that don't come across so clearly in the other books I've read by physicians. Even Paul Kalanithi, who I talked about last time, or the very thoughtful Atul Gawande. I suppose that is one reason why I think this book might be meaningful for readers who have no special interest in healthcare per se, but who do love to read memoirs where authors have that ability to tap into deeper themes. I enjoyed the book so much that I picked up First Cut, A Season in the Human Anatomy Lab by Albert Howard Carter III. And while I enjoyed this book too, I wouldn't recommend it to general readers, I don't think. It's an account of an adult man who observes one medical school's incoming class as they work through their experiences in the anatomy lab. He does try to link his own personal concerns to what's happening, but the book doesn't have the immediacy or perhaps the universal resonance that Montrose was able to express. Part of that may just be that he's merely an observer, not one of the people who is actually doing the dissecting himself. And First Cut is a bit older, written in 1997 instead of 2007, as Body of Work was, and it feels surprisingly dated in style, with a certain kind of humor that feels a little too Greg Brady, which might be from the generation of the author, if I had to guess. I suspect that won't explain things to many of you unless you are no longer young yourself. There are moments where he makes creepy statements about how beautiful the female students are, even though he's old enough to be their father, etc. Finally, I want to mention a slightly different take on the subject, written by Jonathan Reisman. This is a brand new book, published at the end of 2021, entitled The Unseen Body, A Doctor's Journey Through the Hidden Wonders of Human Anatomy. The book is not about dissection, although Reisman does mention it, but about how anatomy works in living humans. I love the cover. I haven't finished reading it yet. Actually, it's terrific for reading in small bits, along, since each chapter functions by itself at a certain level, although everything is in fact tied together. This book is full of some fairly serious science, but fully accessible to readers who know very little about how the body works. The narrative is quite personal, told by the author in a charming and sometimes funny style. The book is also gorgeously written and full of well-employed metaphors the author draws from his extensive travels and his study of the natural world. Let me read you one section in a chapter that combines a discussion of Reisman's study of the waterways of the Russian Far East where he's traveling with an exploration of the cardiovascular system. He talks about memorizing all of the human body's terrain maps. Each drop of blood pumped out of the heart first enters the aorta, the body's main river. When it reaches a confluence, it turns and follows the smaller tributary artery, which leads toward smaller and smaller branches of the arterial tree, each turn bringing blood closer and closer to its destination in the body. He follows the body's blood through the human tributaries before it begins, quote, coalescing back together again, where blood eventually reaches its delta in the very same singular place where its journey began, the body's true center, the heart. Well, that will do it for today. I know these are not necessarily books you've all got on your nightstand right now, so I especially appreciate the fact that you're watching this video. I would really love to hear what you do have on your nightstand, especially if you have something you suspect no one else is reading right now. What weird rabbit holes do you find yourself going down? And what do you discover there that actually might be great choices for a whole lot of readers who might never think to pick up those books? Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.